Testing one, two. Testing one, two.
Let's do it. The subcommittee will come to order. I know that many of our members are in several subcommittees in other committees, so they will be scooting back and forth during our hearing. So please excuse our absence at any time during your testimony, and don't think it has anything to do with you. It might have to do with you, but not the others. But after recognizing myself and the ranking member Deutsch or Mr. Connolly, if Mr. Deutsch is not here promptly, for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our first witnesses, and without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. Following the completion of our first panel, I will then introduce our second panel of witnesses, and their prepared statements will also be made a part of the record. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. Egypt has long been considered a key state for U.S. national security objectives in the Middle East and North Africa, and for over 30 years, our two nations have shared strategic military and political cooperation. For its part, Egypt reached a peace agreement with Israel in 1979, and since then, the United States has provided Egypt with billions of dollars in military and economic assistance. In return, Egypt keeps the peace with its neighbor and our strategic ally, the Democratic Jewish State of Israel, and it also provides us with access to the Suez Canal that gives us a critical route for transit between the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf or the Indian Ocean. But today's Egypt isn't the Egypt of '79 or even 2009. When the Arab Spring began, few thought Mubarak would fall. Mubarak was forced to step down, and Egypt was finally able to begin the transition toward freedom and democracy. But Egypt was a society that never had any experience with democracy. There was no foundation for democracy and governance, civil society, rule of law. They were just millions of Egyptians who knew that they wanted something better, and they just didn't know how to achieve it. Perhaps sensing that the time to open Egyptian society was near, the United States government began to fund democracy and governance programs in Egypt a little over a decade ago. What started out as a relatively modest program with lofty goals and objectives, the Arab Spring of 2011 and the Egyptian streets response proved that there was indeed the need and the desire for such programs in Egypt. That year, the U.S. government increased our funding for democracy and governance from $13 million in fiscal year 2010 to $72 million in fiscal year 2011. Due to the ongoing unrest that later became the Egyptian Revolution, the Egyptian government began to strongly object to some of U.S. government's planned democracy and governance programs, and the Ministry of Justice began targeting or implementing partners in Egypt. Then, in December of 2011, Egyptian authorities raided the office of 17 local and foreign NGOs, including 4 American NGOs who were implementing U.S.-funded programs: Freedom House, National Democratic Institute, NDI, the International Republican Institute, IRI, and the International Center for Journalists, ICFJ. 43 of the employees of these NGOs were arrested, and they were charged with operating offices in Egypt without being registered and receiving foreign funds without the approval of the Egyptian government. Despite the ever-changing and fragile state of Egypt's transition to democracy, from the time of the arrest until the time they were convicted in June of last year, the one constant that remained was that these 43 individuals were pawns in a politically motivated dispute between the Egyptian and the U.S. government. The NGOs were merely doing their job and operating how they believed to be in accordance with Egyptian law. Yet they were arrested, they were tried, they were convicted in a politically motivated operation. And many people may think that because we got the Americans out of the country and back to the United States, that their struggles are over. But that is not remotely the case. This conviction has loomed over their heads like the sword of Damocles, and as they have to live their lives in constant worry of the repercussions. That is why in June of 2013, my colleague Jerry Connolly and I requested that GAO conduct a review of U.S. economic and security assistance to Egypt. GAO will present today their findings of the first phase of the report that deals with the NGO and civil society issues. Today's hearing is important to tell their stories and let us know how this has impacted the lives of these 43 and their families, and how has it impacted U.S. democracy and governance programs in Egypt and elsewhere. Our witnesses deserve to be heard. We need to hear their story. Because the fight for civil society, the fight for democracy, for governance, for rule of law, and human rights in Egypt is nowhere near over. The transition to democracy is still fragile, and al-Sisi has a long, hard road ahead. One of the easiest ways that he can prove to Egyptians and the U.S. that he is serious about this task is to immediately and unconditionally pardon the 43 NGO workers. We have seen mass arrests, and we've already seen journalists from Al Jazeera arrested and sentenced to 7 to 10 years in jail. These are not signs of an open and inclusive society that respects human rights. Just because Egypt lives up to its obligations under the peace treaty with Israel doesn't mean that the United States will continue to provide assistance unconditionally and disregard human rights conditions, because we will not do that. While we recognize Egypt's commitment to the Sinai and security threats, there must be an improvement in Egypt's human rights record, and it must take steps to advance the aspiration of the people of Egypt toward democracy. And with that, I'd like to yield 5 minutes for an opening statement from Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I certainly associate myself with everything you've just said. And it's been a privilege to work with you on this matter and in requesting the GAO study in question after the conviction of 41 employees of 4 non-governmental organizations in June of 2013. The NGOs, which included the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, the Freedom House, and International Center for Journalists, were operating in Egypt with direct U.S. funding. We provided over $140 million for democracy assistance in Egypt since 2009. The government, the Egyptian government, had previously objected to NGOs receiving this direct funding. In what is perceived as retaliation for the U.S. continuance, the NGO offices were raided in December of 2011, and an investigation and trial ensued. The U.S. State Department put together a concerted effort to provide the NGOs with diplomatic, legal, and financial assistance for their defense. In an unfortunate miscarriage of justice, the 41 charged employees were convicted and sentenced to 1 to 5 years in prison. These wrongfully convicted NGO employees have since had to live with the burden and stigma of a court conviction on their records. Given this episode, and for several other reasons, count me a skeptic on Egypt's commitment to promoting civil society. The military coup in July of 2013 and the subsequent brutal crackdown against dissidents was a clear message to the United States that the democratic transition in Egypt was all but over. Since the coup, 16,000 people have been jailed, and 2,500 Egyptian citizens have been slaughtered in the streets in confrontation with government forces. Congress fortunately issued a response to the violence when it included in the FY 2014 Omnibus Appropriations Bill a requirement that the Secretary of State must certify that Egypt is meeting its commitment to democratic transition and taking steps to govern democratically prior to the release of certain military assistance. While the Secretary has certified Egypt is upholding its peace treaty with Israel and its strategic commitments to the United States, he has yet to certify Egypt's commitment to democracy, understandably. It's not difficult to see why. The same military that executed a violent suppression of dissent was afforded further power and autonomy under the Constitution adopted just this past January. Since the election of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the former Commander-in-Chief of Egyptian Armed Forces, his government actions have provided further cause for concern. In response to the conviction of 3 journalists in June, Secretary Kerry responded, "Today's verdicts fly in the face of the essential role of civil society, a free press, and a real rule of law. I call," the Secretary said, "on the President to make clear publicly his government's intention to observe Egypt's commitment to the essential role of civil society, a free press, and the rule of law." That's our Secretary of State. I welcome statements from the administration that call out this regression in Egypt. I hope our witnesses today from the 4 prosecuted NGOs can provide guidance on how we return to a path toward democracy in Egypt. The draft law on associations released on June 26 by Egypt's Ministry of Social Solidarity does not engender such confidence and its commitment to civil society by the Egyptian government. The law would allow the government to dissolve NGOs that, quote, threaten national unity, unquote, and inspect their office spaces. Sound familiar? Human Rights Watch has deemed the measure the death knell of NGO independence in Egypt. The organizations represented by our witnesses have institutional knowledge about operating in that country, and I would like to know how this new legislation, Egyptian legislation, would further hinder NGOs that have taken up the cause simply of trying to promote democratic civil society in Egypt. I fear that answer will not be a hopeful one. Congress must consider this and other developments as we weigh requests for continued financial and military assistance as part of an important bilateral relationship. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Connolly. I'd like to tell Mr. LaHood that this is a baby-friendly committee, so you should get that little one back. We like those sounds. So pleased to yield 1 minute to Mr. Wilson of South Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for your strong support in promoting democracy in Egypt. Egypt is a very important and appreciated friend of the United States. I know firsthand of the extraordinary people of Egypt. My dad passed through the Suez Canal in 1944 as he was a flying tiger on the way to serve in India and China. And recently, my son Julian served with the South Carolina Army National Guard in Operation Bright Star in Egypt, and he was very, very impressed by the positive people of Egypt. We have high hopes for the people of Egypt, one of the world's great civilizations, and I want to again thank you for having this hearing today.
Thank you to your family for their service. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. And now I'd like to allow Mr. Deutsch for his opening statement, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I'd like to particularly thank you and Congressman Connolly for your leadership on this issue over the past year. In particular, thank you to our witnesses for appearing today, and I welcome back Mr. Johnson. Thanks to you and your colleagues at GAO for the great and important oversight work that your agency provides. It's been a little over a year since the convictions against 4 American NGOs were handed down by an Egyptian court. Employees of these organizations were accused of political subversion, engaging in political activity, and receiving unauthorized funds from a foreign source. These are still dubious accusations at best, and their convictions deeply trouble me. Many of us are still hopeful that the election of President Sisi can set the country back on a democratic path, but it's difficult to see a way forward if these convictions are allowed to stand. The United States has spent tens of millions of dollars annually on democracy and governance programs in Egypt. And from 2009 until March of 2014, funding for these programs totaled $140 million, and our spending on these projects jumped from $13 million in fiscal year 2010 to about $72 million the following year, reflecting the hope that the People's Revolution could lead to important democratic changes in the country. Instead, we saw the election of Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood government, which led to a brutal crackdown on civil society and a severe restriction of human rights. Ultimately, the raid on the 4 U.S.-based NGO offices in December 2011 led to the conviction of 43 NGO employees, Americans and Egyptians, in June of 2013. These NGO programs were intended to increase space for and widespread participation in civil society organizations. Instead, that space is dramatically constricted as U.S.-linked organizations were accused of foreign interference. The persecution and the prosecution of NGO workers is unacceptable. It was unacceptable under Morsi, and it's unacceptable under President Sisi. The United States must send a clear and consistent signal to the Egyptian government, whoever is in power, to the Egyptian people, and to the world that fundamental democratic principles such as the rights of assembly and association must be upheld. Many of us were troubled in November 2013 when the government passed the protest law, which banned public gatherings of over 10 people without a permit. Egyptians are now facing a draft law on associations that would impose severe restrictions on civil society organizations and subject them to undue oversight and interference by the government. Now, let me be clear. I fully support our relationship with Egypt. It's a critical strategic relationship. But I urge the government to avoid any actions that will stifle civil society or restrict basic democratic freedoms for its people. The country has undergone many changes in the past 3 years, and I am hopeful for a brighter and more prosperous Egypt. The government has maintained its promises to move quickly towards elections, but as we all said 2 and 3 years ago, an election doesn't make a democracy. This government must be responsive and it must be inclusive. At the same time, U.S. government policies must reflect this shifting environment. Our policies have to be able to predict and effectively respond to the actions of Egyptian government. Mr. Johnson, in your testimony, you refer to the GAO recommendation that State Department and U.S. aid should determine lessons learned from the NGO incident and incorporate them into future policy. I look forward to hearing how we can ensure that the kind of work that we want to do with civil society can continue while ensuring that those on the ground have the necessary protections that they need. Now, I know that there are those who believe that the U.S. should disengage from countries when there seem to be discrepancies between their approach to democracy on a daily basis and our own, particularly if those countries are far away. But I firmly believe that our partnership with Egypt is vital to ensuring the security of this country. Cooperation with the United States and our regional partners like Israel and Jordan on security issues is just one piece of that puzzle. A strong, stable, prosperous Egypt can serve as an anchor in a volatile region, and we have to seek to balance our relationship accordingly. To our witnesses and the organizations you represent, thank you for the work you're doing around the world to build civil society, to strengthen the rule of law and governance, and to promote human rights. The prosecution and conviction of these 43 men and women should remind us that the work that you do is not easy, and we're grateful for your efforts. I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Rohrabacher is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. We should note that many of the things that we will be judging Egypt on are not going to be based on what's happened during a time of turmoil where you have a change of authority in government. Egypt came this close to being dominated by a radical Islamic philosophy that would have destroyed the chances for peace and stability anywhere in the Middle East, and would have, especially in dealing with the Israeli conflict that's going on right now between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And the people of Egypt went into the streets by the hundreds of thousands and joined by the military, decided they were not going to have a radical Islamic caliphate controlling their country. During that time, when that was being prevented, yes, there were many people who were arrested who would not be arrested under normal circumstances. And it is time now, however, for those of us who support a democratic and stable and positive Egypt to join with others in the demand, not the demand, but the request of the current government to start going back towards real democratic principles. And they could start, for example, by releasing these 43 NGO workers that were arrested, and by releasing the 6 journalists that are now being held in Egypt that President al-Sisi now says was a mistake to have them arrested in the first place. So let's not judge Egypt on what happened during this time of turmoil as they were changing and trying to get away from a radical Islamic caliphate and towards a more democratic society. Let's now judge them as they build their democratic society and judge them based on how they do with things like this. Thank you very much for your leadership, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. Mr. Cicilline is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I want to thank you and Ranking Member Deutsch for calling this very important and timely hearing on the state of civil society in Egypt. And I particularly want to thank you, Chairman, and Congressman Conley for your early leadership and requesting the review and report, which we'll hear about today. Egypt has been an important and long-time ally of the United States and receives $1.3 billion in military aid each year. Yet, despite public statements supporting democratic changes, the military-led government has failed to carry out many basic reforms that would signal its commitment to rule of law, human rights, and media freedom. The egregious case of the 4 organizations before us today is just one example. Though this case began under a different government, also led by the military, the current leadership has done nothing to rectify it. Meanwhile, the staff involved have had their lives threatened, their families harassed, their reputations questioned, and some have had to flee the country to avoid prison. Since the El-Sisi government took over, civil societies have faced harassment, journalists have been imprisoned, and more than 16,000 political prisoners have been detained. Political reform takes time, to be sure, but Egypt is not on a good trajectory at this point in time. And I look forward to hearing the testimony presented today, particularly the panelists' views on how the United States can productively support reforms that protect fundamental human rights in Egypt. And I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cicilline. Seeing no further requests for time, our subcommittee is delighted to welcome back Mr. Michael Johnson, who is the Senior Executive and Director of International Affairs and Trade at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. In this role, he assesses U.S. counterterrorism and security efforts, focusing on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other terrorist safe havens. Prior to this position, Mr. Johnson was an assistant director in GAO's Homeland Security and Justice team, and he also spent a year detailed to the House of Representatives Homeland Security Committee. You poor thing. Was that under Peter King? Oh, that's got to hurt. Thank you so much, Mr.
He used
Johnson.
to have hair then, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. You are recognized, and your prepared statement will be made a part of the record.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chairwoman, Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, members of the subcommittee, I am pleased to be here today to return before the subcommittee to discuss the results of our report being released today on the U.S. democracy assistance efforts in Egypt. This report focuses on 3 issues. First, the extent to which the U.S. government identified and managed the risks of providing direct assistance through the Democracy Assistance Program in Egypt. Second, the types of support that the U.S. government provided to the non-governmental organizations. The extent to which the U.S. government Democracy Assistance Program was affected by the prosecution of NGOs. But before I get into the specific findings of that report, I'd like to provide a little context. For over 30 years, as you've noted, the Egyptian government has been a key U.S. partner, receiving billions of dollars in U.S. economic and military assistance. For over a decade, the U.S. government has funded democracy assistance in Egypt at the tune of approximately $140 million since fiscal year 2009. This included direct funding to NGOs totaling about $65 million after the January 2011 revolution, which ended, as you know, the Mubarak presidency. The Egyptian government, however, objected to how the U.S. was providing this assistance to NGOs, asserting that the U.S. was violating the terms of an agreement or process that the 2 governments had outlined. The Egyptian government raided, as you noted, the offices of several NGOs, including 4 U.S. NGOs, and charged and convicted employees of these 4 organizations with, among other things, operating an unauthorized organization in Egypt. The U.S. government noted its disagreement with the actions and the efforts and views of the Egyptian government. With respect to the findings outlined in the report being released today, first I'd like to note, regarding the efforts to identify and manage risks, we did find, consistent with State Department and USAID and Federal Internal Control Standards, that the U.S. government had identified and took some steps to manage the risks of funding democracy assistance in Egypt. Some of that effort goes back to 2005. This included awareness of the Egyptian government's likely objection to the U.S. plans to directly fund NGOs after the 2011 revolution. We do note, however, in our report that State and USAID had not done enough to document and incorporate the lessons learned from the experience in Egypt. Applying lessons learned, as we previously reported, can, among other things, inform future decisions, help to inform future work processes and activities, and provide a way forward. Second, and related to NGO support, we report that the U.S. government had provided the 4 prosecuted NGOs with diplomatic, legal, financial, and grant flexibility support. With respect to diplomatic support, this included holding multiple meetings with Egyptian officials to try to defend or prevent the prosecution of NGO employees. Legal support included working with NGO lawyers to develop legal strategies. Financial support allowed the 4 NGOs to use about $4.9 million in grant funding to pay for various legal costs. NGOs were also allowed to modify their grants to adjust their planned activities and timelines. Third, we report that the prosecution of NGOs did, in fact, affect U.S. democracy assistance in Egypt. More specifically, the 4 prosecuted U.S. NGOs currently cannot operate and conduct activities inside Egypt. And these NGOs had to cancel some activities, such as election observations, voter education, and political party training. As the figure you'll see that's being projected shows, since the start of the NGO trials in 2012, the amount of U.S. funding for democracy and governance projects in Egypt has decreased, going from a high of about $72 million in fiscal year 2011, which some of the members noted, to about $6 million in fiscal year 2013, its lowest level during the 2009-2013 timeframe. The number of awards, as the figure also shows, also declined during the same period, from a high of about 100, as the figure shows, in fiscal year 2011, to a low of about 15 in fiscal year 2013. In closing, we recommend in our report that the Secretary of State and USAID Administrator take steps to incorporate lessons learned from the U.S. experience in Egypt into plans for managing risk to future democracy assistance efforts. The State Department and USAID both concurred with our recommendation. I thank the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify today, and also would like to personally thank the GAO staff who traveled with me in Egypt, Ryan Vaughn, Drew Lindsay, and Rachel Dunsmore, for their efforts on this particular engagement. This concludes my prepared statement. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Charles Michael Johnson. Thank you. We just had the pleasure of receiving your testimony last month on our reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan. We thank you for that. And your GAO team's assessment of our oversight and accountability of U.S. assistance there in Afghanistan. And while this report is focused on our democracy and governance programs in Egypt, your report has a certain similarity to the previous one. You reported that even though state and USAID have been receptive to your recommendations, and from looking at the report, you paint both agencies in a good light in terms of how they reacted to the NGO trial in Egypt and how they supported the 4 NGOs and the employees. But there's still a lingering problem with the access that you were given. You told us at the last hearing that it would be helpful if state and USAID granted your team more timely access to the documents that you had requested, and I'm seeing that same theme in this report. Could you comment on how this issue, timely access to documents, impacts your work?
Yeah, I'd like to note that we continue to experience some challenges in getting timely access. The process in particular for getting access from both USAID and state, in particular on this Egypt engagement, was quite burdensome and difficult. There were, both agencies required, as I noted in my last testimony, our employees to go to a reading room to look at materials. They limited our ability to take notes and also to make copies of the documents as well. This is definitely an unnecessary and unburdensome type of approach for us to do our work and provide you guys information in a timely manner. So we continue to experience some challenges with both agencies. In particular, Egypt is one of the case studies that we've worked on in agreement with USAID to see how things can be improved. And I would have to say that this case study is not going well at all.
Well, following up on what you just said, you say that lessons learned from Egypt should inform future U.S. plans, and that Egypt is a model case. But clearly, this all happened, or the process began several years ago. Is there any indication that state and USAID identified these problems in Egypt and began implementing corrective measures across the board to avoid a future scenario like the one we saw in Egypt early on in the process? And has there been this, or has there been this slow learning curve?
Well, one thing I want to note is it has been made clear to us, and we have seen this in the work we've done. It is definitely a challenging situation that the U.S. government finds itself in, both state and USAID. With respect to lessons learned, as I noted in my opening statement, they were aware of the risk back in 2005, as early as that point in time. There have been some actions that have been taken that they highlight in terms of establishing working groups and country groups to look into this issue. As part of our recommendation, we always follow up to see to what extent is that going to specifically address what we have asked for. That is to document the lessons learned and to apply those to future plans going forward. So we will be monitoring that. I think they have up to 60 days to respond to their authorizing committees in terms of their specific actions, but they did concur.
Thank you. Your report and testimony discusses the U.S. government's work with these NGOs and our democracy and governance programs. During the course of your field work, though, you interviewed local Egyptian NGO workers and government officials. Who did you meet with in Egypt, and what did you take away from that meeting? Do they feel like civil society remains under attack? How does the Egyptian government describe the case of these NGOs and their employees? Because I remain concerned that they aren't really sure yet which direction al-Sisi will take Egypt, and the new constitution certainly included some good revisions, but also some troubling ones. The new NGO draft law is very troubling, and the mass arrests and the trials aren't in line with democratic ideals. And one of the most important things that al-Sisi can do to prove to the international community that he is serious about leading Egypt into this new era of democracy is to pardon these 43 NGOs, and the U.S. must continue to press this as a top priority. Al-Sisi says it's not within his power, that he cannot do that. Can you tell me about who you met with and what is al-Sisi? Should we push him to pardon it or pardon them, or will he not go that way?
Okay, we actually had a lot of success in country meeting with various officials, U.S. government officials, as well as some of the civil society groups. And in addition, we met with some members of the Egyptian ministries, in particular Dr. Barker, who was the deputy, at the time was the deputy minister of international cooperation. Different viewpoints and different perspectives. Obviously, as I noted earlier, there's some disagreement between the two parties. Let me first comment with respect to the meetings we've had with the U.S. State Department and the USAID representatives. They made clear to us some of the positions they were taking in terms of not agreeing completely with the positions that the Egyptian government was taking and what they were doing to support the NGOs, and in particular to find some relief for those who were prosecuted. With respect to the Egyptian government, most of the meetings we had, basically their position was that the NGOs were in violation of their Egyptian laws in particular, and that
They were not given a chance to register.
exactly. There was a lot of, and that came out of a lot of the focus group meetings we had. We met with about 17 civil society organizations in country, had various roundtables. The views were a variety of views, but in particular, we did hear quite a bit that the registration process was extremely burdensome, and some had registered as far back as 2006, and we're still waiting on registration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. Very pleased to yield to the ranking member, my good friend, Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Mr. Johnson, do state and USAID have the authority to respond to the kind of risks that they face? Are they are there regulations, are there laws that make it more difficult for them to be able to tackle the challenges that they face, the risks that they face?
In terms of obviously foreign policy issues and how we deal with challenges overseas is the purview of the State Department as well. They do have, that's their role. In terms of risk mitigation, we have long reported, whether it's this type of situation or even working in a dangerous environment, that a risk mitigation strategy needs to be in place. And taking that, obviously the practice that we see many of our agencies undertake, and as we've reported, is that you need to apply lessons learned and build on your previous experience in the way forward in terms of how you proceed. So in terms of the ability to do it, we definitely believe and we think that they do have that ability to mitigate risk and to plan for that risk in advance as they move forward.
And so building on lessons learned in what way, and are there other countries where lessons have been learned that can be applied here as well?
Yeah, I mean, just a month ago I talked about the lessons learned that the U.S. government can take from the experience in Iraq and apply those to Afghanistan. That's been a long-standing thing that's been mentioned, and as we talked about in that hearing, you know, the shift from a military-led to civilian-led presence, there are lessons learned there. Similarly here, if we see a situation where the partner country is not as receptive to democracy, obviously we have an experience here as the U.S. is going to face this, is likely to face this challenges in other environments. They need to apply those lessons to those experiences going forward. And even as we go back in and if there's any effort to have conversations and discuss this with the Egyptian government, these lessons that we've gone through need to be a part of that process.
What does that, I'm sorry, what does that mean? If there's a part of the country that's not as responsive to democracy, what does that mean?
Obviously, we're well aware that some of the ministries and some of the members of the Egyptian government were not as receptive to the types of civil societies that the U.S. and as NGOs were promoting, or even NGOs, even Egyptian NGOs were promoting and looking forward to. So that needs to be taken into consideration as we move forward in developing new policies.
And what would those policies be, and what would those policies be, and what message would be helpful coming from here to support those policies?
Well, GA was not in a position to comment on policy. That's the purview of the Congress, the administration, and the various agencies. What we would say is that the lessons learned from Egypt and other experiences need to be applied to that decision as we move forward.
Right, so then go back to what you can actually comment on, which is what to learn from those lessons. Well, I appreciate that. We'll worry about the policies. So you make the suggestions, though, on what would actually matter on the ground for these NGOs and for people who are trying to build democracy.
Right. I mean, obviously, we've gone through an experience here, and obviously different approaches that we've taken in terms of the types of assistance that's provided. Those are things that we have an experience in that we can learn from those lessons going forward. There are, different types of organizations that we fund, and actually the U.S. has had some success working with the Egyptian society and actually moving forward on some democracy assistance efforts. So there are ways that this has worked. Right.
So let's try that way then. Give me an example of something that works that could be used as a model, that could be replicated elsewhere. And
well, again, just to emphasize, we don't do policy, but we are aware that there were some some organizations that were not subject to the NGO registration requirement that can also carry out similar activities. So that's an alternative approach. Obviously, when we're working in environments that are not as conducive or that are challenging, we need to find a way to mitigate. And obviously, that needs to be in the form of these focus groups that they're talking about pulling together. Working groups can study the different things that actually may be acceptable, reach some compromise agreement on those, and try to work through the other means by which we can move forward on other initiatives.
Right. I'm uncomfortable, though, with the suggestion that the way to move forward is to find the groups that have not been singled out and have not been prosecuted. I'd rather figure out ways to avoid having groups who are there to promote democracy.
And I 100% agree with that. What we don't want to do is find ourselves in a situation again where we're doing things ad hoc or we're doing them on the fly as things are evolving. Egypt gives us an opportunity to take these lessons, to document those lessons when you find yourself in a similar situation in any other environment, to know what actually was effective in terms of what worked.
That's great. I appreciate that. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. In reading your remarks, going over your remarks, you said the U.S. government increased the amount of funding it awarded Egypt for democracy and governance assistance from approximately $13 million in 2010 to approximately $72 million in 2011. This funding included an increase in direct funding to NGOs totaling about $65 million.
That's correct.
I'm doing the math, and the increase from $13 million to $72 million is not $65 million. Did I miss something?
The increase from 13 million,
It's on
75 million.
to $72 million.
Okay.
And it says this funding included an increase in direct funding to NGOs totaling about $65 million after the 2011 revolution.
Right. The figure, the combined figure that talks about, it's approximately $71.6 million in terms of democracy assistance in 2011. Not all of that would have been direct funding. The portion we're highlighting in 2011, the surge, as we would call it, or the increase, was $65 million in direct funding to the non-governmental organizations.
Okay. So in December 2011, according to your testimony, the Egyptian government raided the offices, and of course, as we've noted, they arrested and charged. And so now we're saying that the U.S. organizations and the Conrad Adenauer Foundation and the NGOs had to close their operations in Egypt. Is there a vacuum?
As I also noted, there are some groups and some societies that are or have undertaken some of the civil society initiatives. There were some efforts that they're currently no longer able to undertake. I think the political party strengthening was one of the areas probably that was impacted that these groups were involved in. Again, there's a variety of different civil society groups that the U.S. has funded that are operating there.
Okay, and what happens to the $65 million?
The $65 million has been awarded. As I mentioned earlier, there was some grant flexibility allowed where some of the organizations were able to do alternative things. One example is where instead of, I got to be careful how I present this, some of the information is sensitive but classified. There were some efforts to do some of the things online. There as an alternative approach to continue to move forward with some of the initiatives. In addition, some of the timeframes were pushed out to allow the organizations to fulfill their agreement with the grants in particular. Some of the funding, as I noted earlier, was used to provide legal assistance or support for legal costs to some of the NGOs.
Okay, when you say online, that was one of my questions from later on. Pardon me. And that is, does Egypt have a robust open internet?
I'm not sure if I can comment on whether internet is robust and open. My own personal experience there didn't seem to be a problem to access some things through Wi-Fi. But then again, I was in a decent hotel.
Surely the NSA is not reading those emails too. Did I say that out loud?
I have no comment on that particular issue. I'm not aware of that.
Okay. And some say that the United States should no longer provide aid. Some say we should provide more aid. And they argue that the United States must increase funding for democracy and human rights, especially at a time when Egypt needs more funds. In your view, how could the U.S. government best promote the advancement of human rights, including religious freedom, in Egypt, and how would you break that spending down, those funds?
Okay, the specific human rights issue is part of a broader engagement or review that we're going to be undertaking in response to a request from this subcommittee. We will be reporting out hopefully on that issue later. We have a much broader review. This democracy and governance issue is a smaller subset, so at this time we're not prepared to comment on the human rights issue.
Okay. The head of Egypt's National Council for Human Rights called for a delay in passing the law until a new parliament is elected. When's that? What is that date? Do you know? When's the new parliament elected?
I believe it's in the fall. Am I correct, guys? In the fall? In the fall is the time frame we were given.
Do you know the date of the month in the fall?
Let me consult with my staff. Do we have October? Around October of this year is what we were told. We don't have a specific date, but October was the month we've been made aware of.
Okay, it sounds like my grandfather, when he was about 90, I asked him when he was born, and he said, in the spring, I think. So, all right, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Connolly of Virginia is recognized.
Thank you. My friend, that reminds me of the story about a man in his 90s, an Irishman, and was asked, when his birthday was, and he said, March 18th, and somebody said, what year? And he went, every year. Every year. Okay. Mr. Johnson, thank you for being here, and thank you for responding to the chairman's request and mine. Did you interview the NGO personnel who were charged and convicted?
Yes, we did.
And what was it they were charged with?
Specifically, I guess our reading is that they were charged with operating an unauthorized organization in Egypt. That was one of the charges. There's some additional insight in our more sensitive report that you will be receiving later today.
Was there not also, if not an explicit charge, certainly an implicit charge, they were working for a foreign agent, namely the United States government, and that was contradictory to the interest of the Egyptian government?
We did not specifically see that, but I have been made aware that that has been some of the allegations.
Yes. In fact, I think it was an explicit allegation made by the minister at the time during the previous administration. Is it not true that when somebody is tried in an Egyptian court, they're put in a cage? Is that correct?
I'm not familiar. I don't have the details of how they're detained.
Take it from me. And it's a very humiliating experience for a young person. For their families see this, they're shamed. to go back into their communities and trying to explain this is a huge burden. So there's a lot of shame. In addition to the fact you've got a conviction on your record, the whole process is a degrading and demeaning process, and deliberately so. Is that your understanding?
That some of the views, as I mentioned, we met with the full prosecutor NGOs and those in country. Obviously, they feel as if the situation they were put in was a challenging one.
Did you evince any difference between the Morsi government and the al-Sisi government with respect to this issue?
At the time of our review and in-country visit, Sisi was not in power as the president. We did not see much of a difference between the Mubarak period and the Morsi period.
Well, we're now in the al-Sisi period, and the military government's been in power for a year. Are you aware of any difference? Getting any hints? Some emails, some notes, someone whispering in your ear that maybe this government's got a different attitude toward the previous two governments with respect to these innocent NGO personnel who've been convicted?
We definitely look forward in the ongoing work we have underway for you, Congressman, to continue to pursue that and follow up and update the report based on this time frame we've had here.
I do think this subcommittee is going to be very interested in the answer to that question because one senses there's no difference. You talked about lessons learned and risk mitigation strategies with respect to State Department and AID. How did you feel their response was to those two things that you think are very important as part of your recommendations?
I think they were open to, they concur with our recommendations, so that's a good sign. I would say during the course of our work, obviously this is a very sensitive topic, you know, noting, we didn't go as far as to say there were specific detailed risk mitigation plans, but we did give the agencies credit for identifying risk and taking some steps to manage the risk, so we use the word manage the risk. Obviously, this goes back, as I said, to 2005, 2011, no, 13 actually, but there was a cable that we referred to in the report that they did provide, a global cable that was done that began to raise awareness on challenges to democracy and assistance globally.
You visited Egypt yourself?
Yes, in March.
In March. And when you visited the embassy and our aid mission, did you have a strong sense that this was a high priority issue for them in the great panoply of issues?
I had a strong sense that the entire U.S.-Egyptian relationship was a high priority for the folks there. And I got that viewpoint from our State Department, as well as some of the Egyptian government officials on the defense side.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand your answer. I'm asking about the fate of these 43 individuals.
43.
Did you get the sense when you were there?
Yes.
This is a high priority in the constellation of the relationship.
Yes, I would say we would take that away as
Good, because I think that's really important that the Egyptian government understand that we're not letting up on this, and we do care about these individuals a lot, irrespective of nationality. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. And Mr. Shabbat of Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I apologize for having to come and go. I've got actually 3 hearings going on at the same time, and I appreciate your patience here. Mr. Johnson, thank you for your, and I will read your testimony. I just had a couple of questions here. Okay. First of all, I'm pleased to hear that efforts were made to amend the controversial 2012 Constitution by referendum in January. However, I know others have some concern about the new Constitution granting greater power to the military, including military trials of civilians. And if you've already addressed this issue, I apologize, but could you comment on that issue?
We really didn't look in detail at that issue in terms of greater power. That's something we have a broader review, as I noted earlier, that we have underway for the subcommittee, and we're going to look at the entire U.S. assistance and our relationship on the defense as well as civilian side. So at some point, we're going to look at, specifically, we're focused on how the U.S. may have adjusted its strategic objectives in Egypt over time. So we may touch on that issue in our additional work down the road.
Okay, thank you. And another issue I wanted to touch on, and I know I heard Mr. Connolly talking about the NGOs and how the government has been pursuing them and how that's made their lives in many ways literally hell, even if they're outside the country, and it makes traveling and a whole range of other things more difficult. And I had the Egyptian ambassador in my office recently, and we discussed this and a lot of issues at length. And we obviously give Egypt a significant amount of aid, and it's one of the highest countries that we do provide that aid, and I have supported that in general over the years because they have been a very important ally, and their relationship with Israel and their leadership in normalizing relations with Israel has been significant, not just to the region, but to the whole world, so I commend them for that. All that being said, that clearly is one leverage point that we have with them on this whole NGO issue and resolving it in a manner that we think would be just and acceptable to all involved. And of course, he indicated that it could be, I won't go into all the reasons that he gave me in a public forum here, but they would prefer that we not stop the aid until this issue is resolved. Could you comment on that to the extent that you can in a public forum like this?
Well, the decision to stop or to fund or not fund is a policy decision that the agency, the administration, and the Congress would have to make. I guess our primary purpose on this review was to look at what the U.S. has done to provide some sort of way forward. And our takeaway on this particular job is to definitely apply these lessons learned from Egypt, from this experience, as we decide that. And whatever strategies we use, even if that includes certification requirements, withholding funds, or conditioning funds, that's a policy decision. That's something that we think needs to be considered as we do this again in other countries, or even continue this in Egypt. Again, that's up to the Congress and the administration to make that determination.
Okay, thank you. Let me just conclude with more a statement than a question, but it seems that a lot of these, the NGO personnel who have been prosecuted, both Americans and otherwise, that the charges on failing to register or not registering appropriately or operating without the proper documentation and those types of things, that it wasn't at all unusual for this practice to go on, and I don't think anybody was trying to do anything illicit here or to break laws intentionally or anything else. They were just trying to provide a service to Egypt that Egypt should be grateful for, rather than coming down so hard. And this is certainly one of the things that I'm going to measure this new government by, how they deal with this, because I wasn't a big fan of the Morsi government, and as a member of Congress and as a former chair of this committee in the last Congress, I was quite frankly pleased to see Morsi, who I thought was a real danger to the country, removed. And I don't necessarily like seeing a government displaced in extra legal ways, but in measuring this government, the way they deal with this is going to be one of the things that I'm going to consider very much in whether how much my support will be. So thank you very much, and my time's expired.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shabbat. You and many others as well. Mr. Cicilline is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I'd like to first focus on your testimony relative to state and USAID's development of risk management plans. And did you find that those assessments that are done to both develop a risk management plan and to develop, obviously, plans to mitigate risk are done, are country specific, and how often are they updated? And do you have a recommendation as to a change in that policy?
We did not make a recommendation to change the policy, because the policy actually exists in terms of them developing country-specific plans. The issue here for Egypt is that that has not been completed. And I would say that's an issue beyond Egypt and other priority countries that the U.S. has on its radar or as part of our priority. Several country plans have not been completed, despite the fact that some of the countries may be priorities in terms of U.S. national security or U.S. foreign relations issues. So that's a challenge, and we have heard that some of the country teams and country folks in country actually would welcome such plans being completed. The lessons learned piece would be a part of that, should be a part of that. Part of these plans should include risk management strategies and those.
Right, I'm going to get to lessons learned in a moment, but what I'm asking is very specific. Mm-hmm. Is it the current practice of USAID and the State Department to have country-specific plans that assess the risk to NGOs and make recommendations to mitigate that risk?
It is a best practice and internal control standards there should be risk mitigation plans.
No, I know. I'm asking you,
programs
do they
and for-
currently, is that protocol currently in place at USAID and state?
There is a requirement to have the country plans, and as I was noting, the country plans should and are required to have some sort of risk mitigation as a part of those.
And are they required to be updated regularly, annually, or less than that?
My
or more?
thought that those country plans are done within a range of time, 3 to 5 years, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm raising this, it seems to me that in the world in which we currently live, the notion of not having a plan or not having a plan that's not
Documented.
updated regularly is useless. I mean, we're talking about environments that are changing very quickly, and it seems to me, and I'm asking whether you agree, that it would be helpful to obligate USAID and the State Department to develop risk management plans and to give specific guidance to NGOs about the work that they might do on the ground that are country-specific and very current.
Again, we didn't make a recommendation on that, but given they have an existing requirement of policy for the to develop the country plans, we would support the notion of those plans should be routinely updated as is a best practice for strategic planning and risk mitigation planning. So absolutely, those things should be in place, should be routinely updated.
Okay, and thank you. And Mr. Johnson, you just mentioned that the conclusion, both in your written testimony and in your testimony today, is that there are lessons to be learned and that both USAID and states should be sure to integrate and share those lessons within the internal workings of the agency. But while I recognize we ultimately may get to weigh in on the public policy surrounding the lessons, presumably you drew some conclusions about facts on the ground and what in fact those lessons are. So what lessons are there to be learned, recognizing we will decide what the response is in terms of policy, but you clearly made some conclusions about what the lessons are?
Well, obviously, there was a lesson learned in terms of being prepared to provide support to the non-governmental organizations and having that strategy planned out in advance. If you know you're going into a situation where there may be a challenge to any of your implementing partners or U.S. personnel, you should in advance be planning for how you're going to mitigate and counter those challenges or adverse consequences, as we often say. You just have to do that in advance. That's a way of further protecting or deciding how you adjust and make sure you support the U.S. taxpayers' dollars, that they're not subject to any misuse or indirect use or unintended use. So absolutely,
Are there other
document
lessons?
those things.
Are there other lessons that you think are to be learned from what you reviewed in Egypt?
I think there's the discussion that you have with your partner nation that you're engaging with. Those are things that we've seen happen, documenting a process. We have seen, as I mentioned, there's this April 2013 cable that lays out some of the things that they were warning others to pay attention to in the global setting. But we do think state and USAID need to document all those lessons and what they took away from this experience.
Well, I would just ask you if you would give that some thought, and if there are additional lessons to be learned, recognizing we have an opportunity to respond to it in terms of policy, but having the benefit of what you've identified as important lessons would be
Well,
helpful.
I mean, I guess just to quickly comment, the activities that they know they can do can be documented that are less subject to being criticized or challenged. Also, alternative ways to deal with some of the challenges should be documented, knowing that where there are more challenging efforts in certain types of activities should be laid out, and those are less challenging.
Madam Chairman, I just want to say and thank you again, because I think this hearing gives us an opportunity to again reaffirm the ongoing commitment of the United States Congress to press the Egyptian government to address this issue, not only for the Americans and the American NGOs, but for all the individuals and organizations that are engaged in democracy building and strengthening of civil society. And I think Congressman Conley's point that this is something that we intend to stay on and is important to the American people, to our country, and to our standing in the world. And I thank you, Madam Chairman and Ranking Member Deutsch, for giving us the opportunity to make that point very clearly. And with
Thank
that, I
you
yield
very
back.
much, Mr. Cicilline. Dr. Yoho.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Johnson, appreciate you being here.
Thank you, sir.
I have met with several people from Egypt, in the roles of ambassador and associated with the government of Egypt, and I asked them the sentiment of what they see, their outlook when they look at America. What do they see? What do they don't like? And of your neighbors in the Middle East, and I was I guess I was a little bit surprised. He says the sentiment is that America has lost their credibility. They've lost their way. We don't know where you stand, and the goodwill that you had has disappeared, and that you meddled too much. And then I'm reading here the GAO recommendations that the state and USAID incorporate lessons learned from the experience in Egypt into risk management plans for future democracies and government assistance efforts. What have we learned that we can do differently so that we don't make the mistakes of the past, in your opinion?
Again, I would go back and say policy decisions, we leave those up to the agencies, the administration, and the Congress. Obviously, being aware, as I mentioned, that state and USAID were, and the U.S. government was, of the views of our partners are important. That's something that needs to be documented. And going back to comments on the country plans, a lesson learned is to, in your priority country areas, having those country plans that are required include risk mitigation plans or documenting some of the challenges to some of the priorities that we have is important. I think that's something that we've heard that the country teams and the folks in the mission would welcome and encourage. I mean, that's a huge lesson learned that needs to be acted on, that sometimes you need to prioritize which country plans you do first and get those done.
But from your experience, what do you find? Are you getting resentment or blowback in the people saying, you know, you guys just need to back off, let us figure out some of these problems? I've got something here. It says, when did the U.S. government first identify the possibility that the Egyptian government might oppose U.S. direct funding for democracy assistance? What that means to me is they don't want the democracy assistance. We'll work these things out. You're meddling too much. Are you seeing that?
I think we've seen that mentioned by a few individual government officials who were running some of the ministries in Egypt. In terms of some of the civil society groups we met with in Egypt, who are actually Egyptian NGOs or Egyptian civil society groups, they actually welcomed the U.S. assistance, the U.S. efforts and support in terms of promoting democracy.
Okay, that assistance, is it effective as far as, are we getting the results that we as a nation that is helping them out, are we getting the results we want?
Again, looking at, as part of a broader engagement, one of our objectives is to look at the results of that, and we haven't at this stage reported on that in this preliminary work we've done, but we have seen that there have been several activities that have been undertaken by U.S. and some of our foreign NGOs in terms of political party strengthening, election monitoring, voter education, things of that nature.
Okay, with the El-Sisi government, are you seeing an increase in their economic engine? Is it becoming more productive?
We will be looking into that issue as a part of the broader.
But right now, have you seen any change?
Our work basically was done prior to his election.
Okay, but has there been a change in the last, say, 2 years?
There has been.
As far as unemployment, has that gotten better?
All indication from the previous information I've seen is that it has not gotten as far as we would hope for it to get, as well as the Egyptian people. But they welcome the U.S. support in helping them to move forward.
All right. How much foreign aid does China give to Egypt?
I'm not aware of that.
Do you see a presence of them over there?
We did not run into any Chinese government officials while we were there.
Okay. I know China is going around and they're investing in infrastructures in countries, and then they become great trading partners. I would like to see us do more of that instead of trying to tell them how to run their country. I know there's a trade-off there, that we're giving foreign aid that they should follow some guidelines, but I think we need to kind of refocus and do a paradigm shift on how we handle our foreign aid, and I would like to focus on trade and not aid, so that we build an economic engine that we become good trading partners, and in doing so, the Egyptian people will have an economy that's growing and they'll have jobs, and they'll handle a lot of their own problems on their own. Would you think that's a great way to go?
Once again, the policy decisions we leave up to the policymakers. But if that's something you would wish for GAO to
Absolutely,
look into down the road,
I sure would. I appreciate your
our
time.
trade folks.
Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yoho. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. We enjoyed having you appear before our subcommittee again, and I know that it won't be the last time. Thank you very
appreciate
much
that.
for being
Thank you,
with
madam.
us. And I'll give time for the second panel to set up. That will be Mr. Dunn, Mr. LaHood, Mr. Butler, and Ms. Jafar. Thank you very much for being with us. For our second panel, we welcome back Mr. Charles Dunn, who is the Director of Middle East and North Africa Programs at Freedom House. Prior to joining Freedom House, he spent 24 years in the Foreign Service, serving throughout the world, including Cairo and Jerusalem. Mr. Dunn has had a distinguished career in public service, serving as Director for Iraq at the National Security Council, as a foreign policy advisor at the Joint Staff in the Pentagon, and as a member of the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Staff. Thank you, Mr. Dunn. And then we welcome Mr. Sam LaHood, who joined the International Republican Institute, IRI, in August 2010 and relocated to Cairo, Egypt, to be the country director for the IRI Egypt program. While there, Mr. LaHood witnessed the January 25, 2011 revolution and helped build the IRI Egypt program into one of the Institute's largest programs. Mr. LaHood departed Cairo in March 2012, taking an assignment with the IRI Asia Division, and he currently serves as Program Officer for Cambodia and Indonesia. It's a pleasure to see you, Mr. LaHood. Next, we have Mr. Patrick Butler, who is the Vice President for Programs at the International Center for Journalists, where he oversees the development and execution of ICFJ programs and supervises program personnel, in addition to conducting training himself. He was previously the Program Director and Director of Training at the International Center for Journalists. We welcome you, Mr. Butler. And our last presenter will be Ms. Laila Jafar, who is the Senior Program Manager with the National Democratic Institute, focusing on the Middle East and North Africa region. She has more than 10 years of experience developing and implementing programs to strengthen political parties, civil society, electoral processes, and the political participation of women and youth throughout the Arab world. Ms. Jafar lived in the Middle East for the past 20 years, and from 2007 to 2011, throughout the January 25 revolution, she served as NDI's resident representative in Cairo. We're so pleased to have a star group of panelists today, and we look forward to your testimony. Thank you for everything that you do to promote democracy and freedom worldwide. And we will begin with you, Mr. Dunn, and your written statements will be made a part of the record. Feel free to summarize. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman, and Ranking Member Deutsch and other members of the committee. It's an honor to appear before you once again to discuss the human rights situation in Egypt and the cost to human rights workers of the so-called NGO foreign funding case. And I really want to thank you for your continued interest in this issue. Given the chaos and tragedy that's going on elsewhere in the world today, your attention is particularly welcome and very much appreciated. And you're right, this issue, the issue of the NGO case, is very important in Egypt. Why? Should Egypt succeed as a democracy, this will bolster hopes for a stable Middle East. Such a success, by example, and in fact, would advance the interests of the United States and many others in peaceful and effective government in a very rough part of the world. Now, NGOs play an important role in this. They are vital monitors of politics, enablers of social reform, and watchdogs against the scourges of torture, corruption, and other assorted handmaidens of repression. The case against them in Egypt has wreaked havoc on their ability to do this and to promote human rights and the rule of law in Egypt. Many of these efforts, generously funded by the United States government. Remains of the former regime in Egypt never really went away, and they worked from the first months of the 2011 revolution against Hosni Mubarak to stage a comeback. In my view, there is no democratic transition in Egypt today. On the contrary, it's the reverse. It's a transition back to an autocracy that would make the Mubarak government look liberal by comparison. Now, the NGO case was a tactical maneuver in the grand scheme of Egyptian politics. I believe it was intended to do a few things. First of all, to put a scare into the United States about supporting civil society and the mission of civil society. It was intended to frighten domestic Egyptian NGOs, which number in the tens of thousands, from doing work anything remotely related to politics, democracy promotion, human rights, and the whole family of issues that we think of as promoting freedom. Freedom House was subjected to this pushback precisely because our programs were effective. They engaged and empowered private citizens who worked for and felt they deserved better government and basic civic rights. Now, this case has hurt families and it's hurt many friends of ours. Freedom House was forced to cancel grants to several Egyptian NGOs after our work was banned in the country about a year ago. 4 of our employees were forced to flee for fear of lengthy jail sentences. 1 has received political asylum in America. Another is in the process of applying for political asylum. And among them, they have 5 young children from whom they are effectively exiled. I'm lucky. I was not at the trial. I was not in the cage during this spurious proceeding. But I do have to travel wherever I go with a letter from Interpol attesting to the political nature of the charges, and a letter which effectively denies Egypt's request for an international arrest warrant, a red notice for us. On 2 separate occasions, I've been detained and then once deported from an Arab country because of these charges. Both of those visits, by the way, were on work funded by the U.S. government. I have to check with the U.S. Embassy wherever I go in the region before I travel to ensure that I won't be arrested at the airport. Now, Freedom House's Egyptian Democracy Compass has tracked political developments in the country for the last year, and on practically every front, Egypt has regressed. Some members of the committee mentioned the more than 16,000 people arrested. There are estimates that have appeared in the Egyptian press of as many as 41,000 people who have been arrested since the coup. And that says nothing of the many who have been killed, at least 2,500 in protests against the government. Now, if the United States is serious about supporting civil society, human rights, the rule of law, and a real democratic transition in Egypt, in my view, it should do the following things. First, the United States should insist on pardons for all those convicted in the NGO case. U.S. taxpayer money should not be used to subsidize a government that has destroyed American democracy promotion programs and sentence U.S. citizens to jail terms for trying to carry them out. The U.S. should insist on its right, guaranteed under international compacts, to freely associate with and fund NGOs. Second, I believe the United States should reevaluate its basic relationship with Egypt, including military aid, and consider shifting most, if not all of that, to educational and economic support programs. And third, the U.S. must publicly call out human rights abuses so as to encourage our friends in civil society, and it must tell the Egyptian government that we are not willing to continue business as usual without fundamentally relooking at what our relationship is. With that, I thank you, and I'm happy to take any of your questions.
Very eloquent. Thank you very much. We appreciate all the work that Freedom House does. Mr. LaHood.
Thank you, ma'am. Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, members of the committee, thank you, and thanks to all the members of Congress who've supported the non-governmental organizations and our staff who've been caught up in Egypt's crackdown on civil society. Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, I want to thank you personally for the unwavering interest and support you have shown to myself and my colleagues at this table. You have appropriately focused this hearing on the struggles for civil society in Egypt and what a struggle it is. We are living proof of that struggle. On June 4th of last year, I was convicted by an Egyptian court to 5 years in prison in Egypt with hard labor for working to advance democracy as part of a U.S. government-sponsored policy and program. We here were found guilty in a trial that was very obviously politically motivated, and the result was preordained in a bogus trial. It was part of a broader attempt to stifle and intimidate Egyptian civil society, emboldened by events that began on January 25th of 2011. We, the convicted NGO staff, were entangled in an intergovernmental dispute between the United States and Egypt. We were carrying out U.S. policy, and look at the price we paid. This has affected our personal and professional lives profoundly. Since our conviction last June, the full implications of how the verdicts affect us are still emerging. Under Egyptian law, I am a felon. It's unclear how that applies in the United States, so I need to read the fine print when applying for a loan or sign a rental agreement, visa, or job application. In applying for life insurance, my broker believed he was obligated to include my conviction in his application, but he was concerned about the ramifications of providing detailed information about my verdict to the company for fear that it might enter into my permanent record. I'm still waiting for the Virginia Board of Elections to tell me whether I'm eligible to vote. For a lawyer to be admitted to the bar, to be a stockbroker, real estate agent, teacher, or sell insurance, you need to have a clean record, as you know. Every time I fill out an application or questionnaire, I'll be on the lookout for the question, have you ever been convicted of a crime? And I'll need to think very carefully about my answer. As Charles mentioned, our ability to travel internationally is another question mark that hangs over our heads. Clearly, I cannot travel to Egypt. But in numerous other places around the world, how confident can I be that I will not run into legal trouble and be put into proceedings for possible extradition to Egypt? And how do I assess that risk? But I know that my personal hardship pales in comparison to the hardship of others. I never faced the full humiliation of standing in a cage in an Egyptian courtroom, nor did I spend even one day in an overcrowded Egyptian jail cell. Some of my convicted Egyptian colleagues have no option to return home without facing jail time. They are now refugees. Others have lost personal relationships and work opportunities. All of us have been impacted and had the course of our careers and lives altered. It seems crazy to think that for working to advance democracy in Egypt, I would be rewarded with a jail term. But look no further than the 3 journalists from Al Jazeera who are currently serving 7- and 10-year jail terms. Though I don't know Peter Geist, Mohammed Fahmy, or Bahar Mohammed well, I know that they were equally innocent of the ludicrous charges that they were put on trial for, as those of us here today were. A revolution began in 2001, which broke the barrier of fear among civil society activists in Egypt. But their activities are now being increasingly stifled by a regime that is attempting to put the genie back in the bottle. Change is not always linear, but it's always hard and it's always a struggle, as you know. IRI continues to partner with those Egyptians who want to build a more democratic and open society. We hope that the Egyptian government will soon make that possible. The same court that made a mockery of justice, unfortunately, not only has the power to punish Americans in their country, but unless action is taken in our country too. Do we really want to tell authoritarian governments that they have the power to affect the lives and prospects of innocent Americans? The U.S. Congress can statutorily affirm that the convictions of the 43 NGO staff are not recognized under U.S. law and were politically motivated. This would remove the legal question mark over our heads and the frustration of trying to determine under 50 separate state jurisdictions whether the convictions affect our ability to conduct routine, everyday business. The U.S. government should not downgrade support for Egyptian or international civil society organizations like those here today. To do so would be abandon our partners in Egypt as well as the values for which the United States stands. There are many Egyptians who continue to be arrested and thrown in jail on trumped-up charges. I would urge the United States continues to support those committed to advocating for freedom and democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Powerful testimony. We thank you very much for sharing it with us. Mr. Butler.
Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, and other distinguished members of the committee, thank you for allowing me and my colleagues the opportunity to testify before you today. As you know, more than a year ago, I and 42 other NGO workers were convicted in an Egyptian court for working on programs designed to build democracy, monitor elections, and train political parties and journalists. We were given sentences ranging from 1 to 5 years in prison. After an initial stir and expressions of outrage from the State Department and members of Congress, the case has largely faded away. Most people who knew about the case probably think it was resolved long ago. That's why we're especially grateful to you for having us here today. More than a year later, nothing has changed except the lives of the convicts, mostly for the worse. Most Egyptians convicted in the case are in exile, often separated from their families, their immigration status in limbo, unable to earn a living. For Americans and other non-Egyptians, the convictions have prevented international travel or thrown up obstacles in everything from applying for jobs or loans or getting a security clearance. The case was an early indication of changes to come in Egypt. We were the canaries in the coal mine. In the past year, Egypt has seen a brutal crackdown on opposition groups, civil society workers, and journalists, including the conviction last month of 3 Al Jazeera journalists who dared to interview members of the banned opposition. Everything the Egyptian leadership is now doing to intimidate the country into acquiescence could have been foretold by the verdicts last year against us. I was one of 5 people working for the International Center for Journalists who were convicted in the case. The others were Americans Michelle Betts and Natasha Tynes, and our Egyptian colleagues Yahya Ghanem and Islam Shafiq. Michelle, Natasha, and I were not in Egypt when the charges were filed, but we were immediately labeled fugitives from justice. Yahya, who's with me today, and Islam were in Egypt, and they attended every hearing in the stifling hot cage, sometimes sharing the cramped space with murderers and rapists. Like other NGOs, we brought the Egyptians out of Egypt before the verdict was announced, and they have not returned home since. For me, the conviction has been an inconvenience. I probably will never go back to Egypt, and I may not be able to travel elsewhere in the region either for fear of being extradited. I know I will still have a job even if I can't travel to the Middle East, but Michelle and Natasha are freelance media development contractors, and when they can't travel to the region, they lose work. The convictions have seriously affected their livelihoods. For our Egyptian colleagues and friends, though, the convictions are nothing short of catastrophic. Yahya Ghanem, an esteemed Egyptian foreign correspondent and editor with nearly 30 years of experience, is in perhaps the worst situation of any of the convicts. Because of his seniority, his 2-year sentence was not suspended, as it was for many other Egyptians. That means he will go to jail if he returns to Egypt. Yahya has not seen his wife and 3 children or his ailing mother in more than a year. His distinguished career in Egypt is over, his pension lost. ICFJ helped him get a fellowship as a journalist in residence at the City University of New York for the last academic year, but the fellowship was not enough to permit him to support his family in New York. While he has been here, his family members have continued to suffer harassment in Cairo, including 3 raids on their home by security officials seeking Yahya, even though they know he is in the United States. The most recent raid happened Sunday night. The raids these raids and one against the family members of Nancy O'Kyle, another Egyptian defendant, prove that while the U.S. government seems to have forgotten the case, the Egyptian government certainly has not. Yahya is now looking for a job and hoping to bring his family to the United States. His greatest hope is to receive a green card so that he has the security to work either in the United States or in a Middle Eastern country that will not extradite him to Egypt. So far, we have not been able to get him a green card. Islam Shafiq has brought his wife to the United States, and they now have a young son. They are applying for asylum, with Islam's family continuing to receive threats against him on a regular basis. Islam's father died while he was in exile. He was not able to return home for the funeral. Every one of the convicted NGO workers, Americans, Egyptians, and citizens of other countries, has a story like this to tell. The case has ruined many people's lives, and for what? In our case, for trying to help Egyptian journalists do a better job of reporting on issues that matter to their audiences. The verdict, as we all know, was a sham, based entirely on political calculations and not at all on the evidence presented in the case. But the greatest tragedy of this case is not its effect on individuals like Yahya Ghanem or any of the 4 of us before you today. The greatest tragedy is what this case has meant for the people of Egypt. The country's authoritarian government learned the consequences of its prosecution of Americans and Egyptians working together to improve their society. Nothing. There were no consequences. Now, with political opponents, human rights workers, and journalists regularly jailed, and most of Egyptian society scared into silence, we are seeing how Egypt is putting into practice what it learned from our case. In closing, I urge you to do all you can for our Egyptian colleagues especially. They are suffering the most from this case. When the charges were filed, U.S. government officials and members of Congress visited them and promised to do all they could for them. Many feel that those promises have been forgotten. Help us get them green cards so that they can have a stable life and support their families in the U.S. They paid a price for working on U.S. government-funded programs, and they deserve our thanks. Again, my sincere thanks to this committee for having us here today and keeping this case alive.
Very much, Mr. Butler, and thank you for always pointing out the other folks who are suffering so much. Thank you. That says a lot about each and every one of you. Ms. Jafar, we look forward to your testimony.
Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member Deutsch, thank you for this opportunity to testify today about the criminal convictions handed down to me and 14 other employees of the National Democratic Institute who were put on trial in Egypt. I also want to thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and many of your colleagues for the continued statements of support that you have issued for those of us who must now carry the burden of these unjust convictions. And I also wish to thank the many Egyptian civic organizations and political leaders who have voiced their statements of support, especially those for whom public statements resulted in charges of their own. On June 4th, 2013, I woke to find that I had been found guilty in absentia by an Egyptian court. The inflammatory rhetoric in that verdict contradicts the reality of our programs, which included election observation approved by the government of Egypt, as well as nonpartisan voter education, civil society development, women's candidate training, and long-term political party strengthening for more than 50 registered political parties. There can be little doubt that the goal of this verdict was to reduce or eliminate international support for independent civil society in Egypt. This unjust verdict has been incredibly disruptive. Some colleagues have lost jobs because the country in which they were assigned to work denied them entry, or their potential employer feared that the verdict would impact their ability to do the job. Others have been detained by police in foreign countries while traveling due to outdated red notices issued by Egypt through Interpol. My initial feelings of shock and dismay quickly gave rise to concerns about my career and family. Although I grew up in California, the daughter of Middle Eastern and European immigrants, I went to university in Lebanon and worked in the Middle East for the past 10 years, 7 of them in Egypt. I built a life there. When charges were filed against us and we were told to leave the country, there was no time to bid goodbye to that life. The Egyptians I worked with and the many participants I had come to count as friends. Now knowing I may never return still creates a deep ache in my heart. This verdict separates me from my family as well. As you see, my parents retired in the Middle East, where several family members remain. Others convicted in the same NGO trial are separated from children, parents, and immediate family. And we are only 43 stories. International human rights groups estimate that somewhere between 16,000 and 41,000 individuals have been imprisoned in Egypt since June of 2013, when our verdicts were handed down. Thousands more have lost their lives. Countless families are affected. When our offices were raided, I remember NDI's President Kanwalik saying it was possible we were like canaries in a coal mine, a warning of even worse things to come. Now the government of Egypt is reportedly considering a new draft NGO law that is even more restrictive than the one under which we were convicted. While not yet final, it contains language that requires Egyptian civil society groups to receive prior approval from the government before conducting domestic fundraising efforts or accepting funding from international donors. The draft law also prohibits any public opinion research and cooperation with a foreign organization without prior notification of the Ministry of Social Solidarity. Those who are deemed to have violated this provision risk 1 year imprisonment and a fine of 100,000 Egyptian pounds. International NGOs like ours would still be subject to the prior approval of multiple government ministries and constant monitoring. That registration could be terminated at any time for any activity that the government deemed to threaten national unity. Our verdict, the raids on the NGOs, the trials of journalists, the protest law, and the proposed NGO law contradict the promises of freedom of expression and association and a free press, which are guaranteed in the 2014 Egyptian Constitution. There is still a great hunger for democracy in Egypt, especially among youth, who now recognize it will take more than street demonstrations to create a more pluralistic and democratic system. Although we have not had a presence in Egypt for more than 2 years, we continue to receive emails almost daily with requests for assistance. More than 48,000 copies of NDI's publications have been downloaded in Egypt since we left the country, and more than 120,000 unique visitors have used NDI's Arabic website. Democratic activists in Egypt do exist, and they are working for genuine political reform. They deserve international support. With all its human faults and failings, the democratic process is an ideal worth upholding and very much in U.S. strategic interests. The fact that this committee is having this hearing and that I was invited to share my story speaks volumes about how our system values individual citizens. It is my hope that one day every Egyptian knows what this feels like, and that I will be able to return to Egypt and share in their joy.
Thank you so very much. Thank you to each and every one of you for the work that you do, the work that your institutions do, and it's very uplifting to hear these shocking stories. And one of the main reasons that we're holding this hearing is to hear about your experiences and what it's been like to those for those affected by last year's trial. You know, people just assume that everything is fine, and that isn't the case. But we move on. A story is the headline of the day, and until the next paper comes, and it's just yesterday's news. We've heard about the human toll that you so dramatically presented to us, that has taken both on your work and on your personal lives. and it's very heartening to hear how concerned you are about your Egyptian colleagues. And we will continue to push for your pardon. And some of you had said in your testimony about this canary in the coal mine, you and the other 42 NGO workers, that your trial was a sign of worse things to come. And earlier this month, we saw al-Sisi say that he regretted the conviction of the Al Jazeera journalist, but he said that only after a significant expression of international outrage. Yet in your testimony, Mr. Dunn, you worry that in Egypt today there's a transition back to an autocratic form of government that would make Mubarak seem liberal in comparison. Do you believe that under al-Sisi there is a chance that civil society conditions will improve, or do you think that it could be even worse than under Mubarak?
Madam Chairwoman, I do believe that it could be significantly worse under President al-Sisi. What we've heard from Egyptian interlocutors, diplomats, and so on for months now is that just wait until General al-Sisi is elected as president, and then you will see a liberalization in the human rights situation. Not only has that not happened, it's gone backwards. Some of us have talked about the numbers of people who've been imprisoned since the coup last year, and some of us have talked about the issues with the NGO law, including an exception for shutting people down and prohibiting activities for public morals charges. Which can be interpreted any way you like, and I think it will be. I mean, clearly it's moving in a more restrictive direction for the kind of work that we do. The other thing that this new law would do, in fact, is limit organizations to doing social welfare and development work. In other words, if you're baking bread or, helping, village enterprises, which is all good, you're fine. But if you're doing the kind of work that all of our organizations are doing, you're not fine. So I don't see a glimmer of hope in the political direction, certainly in the direction of NGOs right now.
Thank you. Now, Egypt obviously is a strategic country and for U.S. assets militarily and politically, but we've seen so much turmoil and so many changes in Egypt that I think we need to re-examine our relationship with Egypt. I know that you had talked about conditioning the aid, move it from the military to education. What are your thoughts for the other three folks? Do you think that the United States should condition our military aid to Egypt until we get pardons for you, or that we see greater respect for human rights or civil society and the rule of law? And also, is there anything that you believe that our government can or should do to improve this draconian new NGO law that many fear will be the death knell for independent organizations in Egypt? What should we be doing to help foster civil society in Egypt and continue the work of political reform? And lastly, the administration, when we were lining up witnesses, we wanted to find out who in the administration is in charge of your cases. We couldn't find a name. We do not know that there is a person tasked with your case, and I worry about that. Please describe your experiences with the administration. What more do they need to do to step up?
If I could just start, but the first thing I'd say is, from my standpoint, when I was in Egypt, I'm very appreciative of everything the Obama administration did to secure Lila and I's release when we were actually in Egypt, when we were in the embassy. And so, from my standpoint, if that pressure hadn't been put on them by the administration, I think I'd be in jail right now. And it's an odd thing to say, but I believe it's true. And I look at the Al Jazeera journalists, and I know it's true. So I'm very complimentary of everything the Obama administration did. Certainly, at that time. But, from my standpoint, I would look at, I think the U.S. government should assess its policy towards Egypt, given all the changing landscape, as you noted. And I think the government should remain focused on our long-term goals and values that led us to support people around the world who bravely stand up to advance freedom and human rights. I don't think the United States government should downgrade support for Egyptian or international civil society organizations because of what's happened in Egypt. I think to do so abandons our values. And I very much appreciate your point about who's in charge of our case within the U.S. government. And I go to events once in a while on Egypt just for fun to harass Egyptian officials who come here, and I run into U.S. officials and I ask them all the time, you know, who's in charge of our case? And the answer is, well, there's a lot of people working on it. And I would say, but if there was one person, who would it be, or what office would it be? And the answer is a lot of people are working on it. We don't need somebody working on it. We need somebody working to find a solution for it, not just following it, not just tracking it. And so that's one thing that I would advocate, that I would love to know who's in charge of it. And the other point I would just make that I've complained about to anybody who will listen is the U.S. government has been very good at keeping the institutes informed of what's going on as it relates to our case, but these are individual charges that we carry forward. I leave IRI, I'm still a convicted felon. It doesn't matter that I work or don't work for IRI. And so that's been one of my gripes, that the U.S. government has done, in my opinion, a poor job of keeping us as individuals informed. And as Patrick sort of alluded to, you know, for some of their employees who were contractors who weren't strongly affiliated with their institute, they've tried to move on with their lives, and they have this cloud that still hangs over their head as individuals.
Thank you so much. Mr. Butler, Ms. Jafar?
Yeah, you know, in response to your first question, ICFJ is a nonpartisan organization that is strictly devoted to improving journalism around the world, and we try to remain independent of advising the U.S. government on what it should do. So I can't really respond in terms of what I think the U.S. government should do in terms of cutting off aid or not cutting off aid. But I will say, as I said in my remarks, that I don't think the response should be nothing, and it feels like that has been the response. In terms of the point that you made, again, I'll back up what Sam said. You're absolutely right. In terms of having a point person at the State Department, we don't have that. I think sometimes that if we don't, as the four organizations, communicate among ourselves, I find out much more from these guys sometimes than I do from you know, people at State, in part because we don't have that one person to go to. I will say that they've been very helpful in a number of things, such as working with, you know, to get Interpol to give us the letters that we take whenever we travel. That was definitely the State Department pushing for us to get those letters that say that these are not valid charges. It took a while, but we got them. We also have a letter from the State Department that says that it does not consider these charges to be valid, and in response to some of the things that Sam talked about in terms of applying for jobs, loans, security clearances, and things like that, this letter should be, as we understand it, reason to be able to say, no, we were not convicted of a felony. But as Sam said, we never really know whether somebody's going to then Google us and find out that we were. So I think you're absolutely right. We would like to have more, you know, one focused person at State that we can go to when we have requests, like how are we going to help our Egyptian colleagues with their immigration status, you know, things like that, to have one person to go to. I think right now, because we have different parts of State funding our different projects, we go to the people who funded us, and that may be very different people. So it would be very, very helpful to have that.
Madam Chairwoman, I would like to, you know, just agree with Sam and what he said. I don't think I would be here today before you if the administration did not help us and support us during the most difficult times of this journey. I also want to say that NDI doesn't take a position on military assistance. However, I think that it's really important that assistance for democracy and governance continue. But at the same time, it's important that the civil society organizations have the space to operate, and that is what is so concerning about the draft NGO law. If it is passed in its form, in its current form, it will be among the most restrictive in the world. So I would just ask that we keep our eye on that law.
Well, thank you very much. You are an inspiration to us all, and I apologize the lack of attendance. It's because we have so many subcommittees, and but we will make sure that we broadcast your words far and wide. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you. Mr. Deutsch is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thanks to all of you for being here and sharing your very personal and very powerful stories. Look, on the point that a number of you raised, I am supremely confident that after this hearing, it will be easier for you to identify someone at the State Department to talk to about the cases I'm I trust that will be a positive and hopefully simple result to come from this hearing. I'd actually like to broaden the discussion a bit beyond your personal situations to the work that you advocate for, and talk about not just what the government, administration, and Congress have done with respect to your convictions, but where the issues that you care about, where you think the issues that you care about place on our agenda on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. Human rights, free expression, women's rights, building of civil society. What is, do you feel the support for, not just for you, but for the work that you do? And if not, what more can be done? What more would you like to hear? And how do we ensure, I guess where the point of my question is, how do we ensure that these issues remain of vital importance to all of us as we tackle the myriad of challenges around the world? Mr. Dunn.
Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take the first crack at this. I think there has been the start of a pullback from supporting many of these issues, not only by the United States, but by European governments as well, who see, at least in the Middle East, that this is getting really hard to do. I think all of the issues that you described, Congressman, are vitally important as a complex of things that we need to support as a country, along with the Europeans, as not just a nice thing to do if we have the time and the money to do it, but as a vital component of our security interests in Egypt and other countries, especially in the Middle East, but also elsewhere. Because you're also seeing a lot of authoritarian pushback. We've seen that in Russia with the EventID mission having to leave. We're seeing a Gulf Arab-led pushback against democracy and human rights in Egypt. And I don't see kind of an integrated policy that supports both security interests, which are vital, including the military relationship with Egypt, but that also include all of these other issues, which lead to better governance and social stability over the long term. I think that more funding needs to be devoted to this, but most importantly, a comprehensive strategy has to be devised by our government in concert with the Europeans and other like-minded governments to advance this.
I appreciate that, Mr. Lehtinen. Mr. Lehtinen, why should human rights matter in our approach to the world?
Well, you ask a great question. I'm going to just try and take a small bite at it. And just from my standpoint, we have a strong focus on security and stability, and I think that's valid. I think that makes great sense. But I think you look at the Middle East today, you look at what's happened in Egypt, and I think you see that stability was a veneer. And it was great while it lasted until it completely falls apart. It doesn't seem to me that it's sustainable. And I just look at Egypt. I was in Egypt on January 25th during the revolution, and I just always look back and think, whatever the plan was on January 24th of 2011 with the U.S. and Egypt, it wasn't a great plan. You look at Egypt the way it was, what the great percentage of people who were illiterate, the great percentage of people who lived on less than $2 a day. Whatever the old plan was, that wasn't a very good one. And I think the veneer of stability has blown up in our faces. And I just don't see the path that Egypt's on now as one that's going to lead to long-term stability. And that's the one point I would make.
Thanks, Mr. Butler.
Yeah, well, obviously the area that most concerns us at the International Center for Journalists is freedom of expression, the rights of journalists to report freely about what's going on. And that has gotten a lot of attention in Egypt lately with the convictions of the Al Jazeera journalists. But I wanted to point out that while that case has gotten a lot of attention, not as much attention is paid to all the other journalists who are in jail in Egypt. There are, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 14 journalists in prison in Egypt. It's one of the highest rates in the world. And those are not necessarily high-profile international journalists working for major international networks. Most of them are local journalists who are, paying the price for trying to report independently. We often say that and I guess getting to your question, one point would be, why should we pay attention to this anymore? Have we gotten to a point where it's not going to matter anyway, given what has happened in Egypt? And I think we often say that there's no difference now between, what we're seeing now under Sisi and what we saw under Mubarak. And that's true to an extent, but there is one important difference, which is that the whole media landscape has changed. And back in Mubarak's day, there was only the official media, and now we have cable networks like Al Jazeera, but we also have social networks, and people are. The genie is out of the bottle, and so people have gotten used to being able to express themselves to do that kind of thing, and you can't completely shut that off the way Mubarak could shut off all independent, or really any kind of independent reporting. So what we do is try to focus often in very repressive societies on other ways of getting information to the public, and that can still happen in Egypt. And obviously we can't work in Egypt, but until this case is resolved. But very strongly echoing what Charles and Sam have said about the need to continue this kind of work, especially in our area of freedom of expression and journalism.
Thanks. Madam Chairman, do we have time for Ms. Jafar to answer?
Mr. Deutsch, I think it's extremely important to continue to work on human rights and democracy and governance because we're looking at long-term stability. I don't think there can be any long-term stability without the space for people to express themselves, for them to participate in the political process. I think even for economic development as well, this is directly linked. How can there be foreign direct investment and progress in the economy of Egypt when there's a crackdown on civil society and human rights violations? So I think it's something that absolutely in our strategic interest to continue to keep an eye on.
I agree with you completely, and I applaud the four of you for your dedication to this issue and the immense difficulty that you find yourselves in still as a result of it. We're really grateful for your appearance here today. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Dr. Yoho.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate you all being here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I've heard you all say that you feel the Egyptian government is moving away from a democracy type to a authoritarian type. Is that pretty much the consensus of all four of you? Ms. Jafar?
Yes, sir. It certainly is mine.
Okay. Why is that? Mr. Dunn, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir. Look, I mean, even if you look at the circumstances surrounding the elections in which the state media were all bent towards General Sisi's election, complaints by his chief opponent were dismissed out of hand by the Electoral Commission, including charges of intimidation at the polling places. That is an indication that the election, while, had the form of a free and fair election, wasn't really free and fair. It was a tightly restricted political space. But we see the restrictions on journalists. I mean, Patrick is absolutely right that there are more outlets now, but we have many journalists in prison, others who are being intimidated, and others who are self-censoring because of, hints from the government. We've had political violence at a level that we haven't seen in Egypt.
But why do you think it's moving more towards authoritarian? Because I agree with Mr. LaHood and Ms. Jafar in that for the last 30 years we've seen a veneer that's washing away, it's eroding away. And I think we're seeing maybe the true nature of what the people in charge actually believe. They don't believe in a democracy. They believe that people need to be ruled through the authoritarian model. Is that what you see?
That is what I see. And while there are, for example, some new, ostensibly more liberal elements in the new Constitution, the rights guaranteed in that Constitution have not been followed in practice over the course of the last year, and it's carved out a space for the military to be absolutely unaccountable to civilian authority.
And I saw that, that the military has been given more authority. And that brings me to a point that I want to bring up. Do the Egyptian people, number one, what do they want? And do the Egyptian people know, understand, or comprehend the meaning or know the depth of what we deem as human rights as we understand them as delineated in our Declaration of Independence, which we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Our country was founded on these principles. What I see over and over again, especially in the Middle East, is we're trying to introduce these to a government, not to the people, and bring it in from the bottom up instead of the top down. Because what I'm seeing is after 30 years or 40 years of the veneer, saying you have to follow these, and they're saying with one hand, okay, we'll do that, but with the other hand, it's the repression that we've seen over and over again, because they don't believe in this. What do the Egyptian people believe in?
I will take a first brief shot at this and then turn it over to others. Polling data that I have seen over the last 10 years consistently shows that the Egyptians, as well as majorities of populations in other Arab countries, believe that democracy is the best form of government for them. They have a different view of what that might mean.
I need to stop you there, because I often say this: a democracy, as Ben Franklin pointed out, is two wolves and a sheep deciding what to have for lunch. The sheep always loses. We're a republic, which protects the rights of the minority. And I think we should promote that more. Instead of democracy, this word democracy is, and I know what we're all trying to say with that, but it's a misnomer, because democracies don't work real well. Republics work pretty good, though.
Yes. Marwan Muasher, who is the current vice president of the Carnegie Endowment, is going back home to Jordan to lead a new civil society organization. He just wrote a book on pluralism in the Arab world, and perhaps that's a better way to describe it. In other words, exactly what you're saying, the rights of minorities, whether they are religious minorities, women, or others, need to be protected and respected. And that's maybe more what I'm trying to say. And I think the population in Egypt really more or less agrees with that. Right now, undoubtedly, their focus is on security and economic success. But the revolution of 2011 was about that, as well as about better governance and the right of the people to be respected in their opinions.
And I admire them for standing up and doing that. Madam Chair, my time's out. I appreciate it. Thank you all very much. Good luck to you.
You are the host of our Florida GOP luncheon, so you better make that good, some good barbecue.
You don't want to miss it.
Get over there and start cooking it. Mr. Connolly is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And welcome to our panel. I just, by way of preface, I want to say that I've heard some rationalization and equivocation among some here in Congress. I believe that we undermine your cause when we rationalize a military coup with a military dictatorship as ruthless as this one. Mr. Dunn, I think you were making the point to Mr. Yoho that this is a whole different magnitude, a whole different level of oppression. It's not just another authoritarian regime in Egypt. The crackdown and the slaughter of citizens on the streets is a whole new dimension. And if we say here, well, we didn't like the Muslim Brotherhood, I didn't either, but our State Department actually said they were elected in a free and fair election. It was overthrown by a military junta, and if American congressmen think that's okay because of ideological preference, then I think we undermine everything you all stand for and have worked for. And I also think, frankly, without intending to, we undermine the cause of the NGO personnel we're trying to champion. We cannot have it both ways. Either we're for democracy or we're not. And we need to have clarity about that in this body. Otherwise, we put you at risk. Having said that, by the way, Mr. LaHood, did I understand you to say you were concerned about your voting status in Virginia because of the conviction?
Yes, sir. I was a resident in Virginia before I moved abroad, and that's where my voting status is, in Arlington, Virginia. And when I moved back to the States last year, they were getting ready for the primary, for the governor primary, and I actually looked up the state law in Virginia is a little bit vague. It basically says if you're a convicted felon and you've completed your sentence, you're eligible to reapply to have your voting rights. I never completed my sentence, and the law is a little bit vague in that it doesn't delineate where they mean by that. And so I actually called the State Board of Elections and asked some questions. They call me back with some follow-up questions, but I never got a clear answer. I'm actually on the cusp of relocating to Maryland, where the law is very specific and says if you've been convicted in a municipal, state, or federal court, which I wasn't, then it
I was going to offer to help you, but if you've got the bad taste of moving to Maryland, there's no helping you.
Well, my wife is from Baltimore, so I don't have much choice. If I'm going to stay in the area, it's got to be Maryland. So I argued for Virginia.
Well, if you come to your senses and move back to Virginia, let me know and we'll help.
But my point is, sir, though, that for us, we face these issues in trying to figure out how this works.
Yeah, exactly. Do I understand from your testimony that the State Department has not given you a point of contact? Who do we go to on our cases or with respect to our organizations, Mr. Dunn?
Yes, sir. That would certainly seem to be the case at present. It used to be that the Legal Advisor's Office was highly involved in this. And again, I have to give them credit for doing what they did in concert with the Justice Department for getting Interpol to vacate the red notice requests, which I understand if those have been issued and they are routinely issued, we would have been in serious trouble about our ability to travel anywhere outside the United States. Having said that, we have not heard from the State Department on this case for probably close to a year since the convictions, and I do think State has moved on from it. And I grant that they have quite a few things on their plate right now, but it's important to us still.
Well, it's important to us up here too. So let us work with you, and I'm appalled to hear that, and shame on the State Department for not staying on top of this and making sure you all have a very clear point of contact who's got some authority to try to answer questions and take actions where necessary. Mr. Dunn, you also talked about the need for an integrated policy, understanding the complexity of the relationship with Egypt. And I think that's a really good point. And I guess what strikes me about how this State Department and about many of my colleagues here in Congress have approached the relationship, frankly, in a very compartmentalized way. So this issue is over here, but after all, we've got, and we have lots of legitimate concerns and needs and priorities, but if we do that, we make it just so much easier for the Egyptian government to do what, in fact, it has done to you and to your organizations. A brief comment before my time runs up.
I would just say, I think that with what's happened in the NGO case, the Egyptian government thinks it just won. It just won this issue, and it accomplished what it wanted to do, which is what I tried to describe in my testimony. And I don't frankly think that U.S. policy has caught up to the new reality in Egypt. And there does have to be this integrated policy which reconciles our security interests, which are very, very real, and our diplomatic interests, as you see Egypt working on Gaza right now, but with the need to promote better governance, civil society, human rights, and the rule of law in the country, and be very clear about that in public. And I have not seen that up to this point.
If the chair will indulge, anyone else want to comment on that? Yeah.
The one thing I would just say to your point is, for the Egyptian government to be able to prosecute our institutes, which are directly funded by the embassy, by the U.S. government, we were doing exactly what we were asked to do by the U.S. government. You look at the board of IRI and NDI, not to mention Freedom House, but John McCain and Madeleine Albright, that they're able to prosecute us for doing this work there. And they get away with it. It sends a clear message throughout Egypt to everyone that they're going to do whatever they want. And I think it's horribly damaging.
And I just want to add one thing, that it's not just a message to Egypt, it's a message to countries around the world. And we've seen, for example, in Ecuador, which is another country that is not so friendly to the United States, crackdowns on NGOs there. We had a project there where we were intending to work there, and we've had to pull out of that country, in part because some of the same things that using some of the same tactics, not necessarily charging, but same kinds of tactics against NGOs that we saw in Egypt.
And Ecuador, if I may interrupt, has hired a PR giant, $6.4 million to do PR for them. And what they do is they charge folks who are opposition leaders with money laundering, drug trafficking, and they're here working the halls of Congress saying that Ecuador, everything is great there.
Madam Chairman, while you were out of the room, the issue of having a point of contact at the State Department came up, and we don't have one. And then knowing of your commitment to this issue, and of course my own, I wonder if you and I might consider a joint letter to the Secretary to remedy that situation immediately. Mr. LaHood.
Just the one other thing that we brought up is, it's not somebody who's a point of contact, but somebody who's responsible for helping us resolve this issue.
Right.
Just to clarify things.
No, that's my shorthand. But I think I did make that clear. It had to be someone vested with the authority to respond to you and make decisions and point us in the right direction when somebody else has the expertise. I agree.
And coordinate a response.
And coordinated response. That's right. But undoubtedly, the chairman and I will work out that language. And
Thank you. Mr. Cicilline is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you again for your testimony and for being here. You know, I think in many ways people do assume when individuals were released that sort of everything is fine, and I really appreciate you sharing with us and with everyone who's watching the impact that this has had on you and others and the implications it has for the rest of your life. And you know, I know a lot of people toss around the word heroes, but you are 4 great American heroes, and the colleagues you represented in your testimony are as well. And we are a better world because of what you do. And just want to say at the outset, thank you for your courage and for the work that you do. In my tradition, we call it tikkun olam, healing the world, which is what you're doing by building civil society and democracy all over the world. So I think one of the challenges we face is that almost by definition, the places in the world that need your work most urgently are the places, of course, where it's hardest to do the work, just by definition. And so, you know, the opposition to freedom and liberty and human rights isn't organic. It's typically the force of some other or structure, whether it's military or government. And so by definition, the places that democracy building is so urgently needed are the hardest places to do it. And as you all know better than anybody, sometimes the most dangerous places to do it. So what I think our responsibility is to sort of figure out what do we do to reduce the danger of this really important, and to your point, Mrs. Jafar, critical to the security interests of this country. This isn't just democracy building because it would be better to live in a world where everyone enjoys these freedoms, which of course it would be, but it is in our direct national security interests to develop democracies and freedom and liberty around the world. And so it's not an extra exercise. It's, I think, central to our responsibility to keep American citizens safe here and around the world. So I take it that the first is, you know, we have to continue to press the Egyptian government about the importance of responding in this case appropriately. I met with the Egyptian ambassador yesterday. This was central to my conversation with him. I think this hearing does that, but I think, you know, I take away that that is something we need to continue to do. Be certain that we're continuing to fund and support democracy building around the world. Don't use this occasion to pull back from that. In some ways, it becomes even more urgent that we stay engaged in this work. Third, that we have to be sure that that people who are doing this work sort of understand that it's not just an important exercise and good to do, sort of like philanthropic work, but it's, again, central to our security interests and making sure our colleagues understand that as well as the American people. Fourth, I think, to make sure that we identify and mitigate the risks in every way that we can and be sure that that information is being communicated to NGOs in country-specific ways so that as they do this important work, that we at least reduce in every way that we can the dangers. And I think the final thing that I would add to that list is, and this sort of builds on something Mr. LaHood just said, is really for us to make the case that these are not individual criminal cases against individuals. While that's part of it, these are really cases against democracy and civil society and the American way of life. And really, if there were some way for us to really almost intervene in these cases as a country, because what the work of these NGOs is not the work of an individual person, although they're the people doing it. It's the work of the United States and the work of you know, intentional decisions by this Congress representing the people to invest in this work. And so I don't know the right way for us to do that, but I think we have got to figure out a way that this becomes our cause, not just the cause of individual defendants in a criminal case. So that's, I think, my list of 6 things, but I wanted, in addition to that, are there other things that we should do or could begin to do as a Congress to advance the work that you and the organizations you represent are engaged in?
Let me just start very briefly.
I'm the last witness, so I figure summaries I can do, you know.
Look, I totally agree with the points you brought up, and just to kind of expand a little bit on the last one, I would also say that we have to insist on the internationally guaranteed rights of civil society in Egypt and elsewhere to associate with organizations such as all of ours. Part of the intention of the new NGO law and the NGO case was to sever those ties so NGOs in Egypt could be more easily repressed. And I think it's very important to continue speaking out on this. And anytime there's a congressional delegation who's going to Egypt to meet with civil society organizations, and I think it would be wonderful if congressional delegations could try to meet with some of the people who have been imprisoned because of their political involvement, such as Ahmed Maher, for example, and others. And the Egyptian government will always refuse, but it certainly makes a public case for the importance of this. One other thing is I'd just like to draw your attention to is the ongoing expansion of anti-terrorism laws in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and other countries in the Middle East, which broadly create definitions of terrorism that include all sorts of political activities. This is one of the reasons why the Al Jazeera journalists were convicted for associating with the Muslim Brotherhood. That's considered terrorism now. And you see similar laws in other places. And that's something that should be, I think, a talking point with a lot of these governments, because it's part of this authoritarian pushback that I was trying to describe earlier.
Yeah, if I could, just a couple of quick points I'd make. You know, first is, as I said in my statement, the finding domestic relief for us is something that would be helpful, obviously. And as I understand, yesterday in the Senate, a bill was actually introduced that referred directly to our case. Senate Bill 2649 was introduced by Senator Lindsey Graham, and he had a few as bipartisan co-sponsors. And I understand that it was a bill to provide certain legal relief from politically motivated charges by the government of Egypt, and specifically about our case. And so that, as I understand, is the specific relief we need to help us here in the United States. But the second point I make is, ultimately for us, what we need is a pardon from President al-Sisi. That's the only thing that's going to lift this cloud that sort of hangs over our heads. And so to the extent that the administration and Congress can keep the advocacy of that up is helpful to us as well. Thank you.
Thanks.
Just a couple quick points. I agree with everything Sam just said in terms of assistance to the organizations and the individuals who were convicted. 2 points. One is that you mentioned the importance of protecting NGOs, of communicating with NGOs, and I think that's a point that was alluded to earlier, but perhaps hasn't been expounded upon enough, which is that in this dispute between the U.S. government and the Egyptian government over the increased aid that was going to our NGOs, we didn't know anything about that, that dispute that was happening between, the objections that the Egyptian government was raising to the redirection of funding towards us. And we could have had the opportunity to decide if, is this something we want to do? I think if we knew that now in another country, we would be very careful about taking that assistance if we knew that the local government had objected to it. So I think communicating with the NGOs, that's obviously an administration thing, not a Congress thing, but that's one point. Another point is, in terms of further assistance, is our grant is over. So we no longer have any funds to support our Egyptian personnel or to support, or for legal costs if there should be additional legal costs. So that's something going forward. We're on the line for paying for all that ourselves if there are additional legal costs, and the Egyptian defendants are appealing their cases. We can't appeal ours, but they are appealing theirs. So that's another point.
I agree with everything you said. I couldn't have summarized it better. I would just add that, it's very important that we continue to support civil society in Egypt. They do feel abandoned. Yes, the environment is a lot more oppressive and challenging now, more than it has ever been. and yet they're still willing to do the work. They're still willing to take the risk to build a better Egypt for their children, for their community. And I think we need to support that both, in terms of assistance, financial assistance, but also vocally as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for sticking around for this panel. It says a lot about you and your interest. And thank you. You inspire us, and we will work all we can do to seek that pardon. Thank you so very much for your wonderful stories, for sharing it, and for the trauma that this has brought upon your lives. Thank you for speaking out for freedom, democracy, the rule of law. You do good work. Thank you. And with that, the subcommittee is adjourned.